Hello everyone. This lecture is going to be looking at an article about education in the American colonies. Before they were American colonies, there was English colonies. So let's go ahead and slide to the article. But the purpose of this is definitely make sure you read the article, but also so that you can see how I read it and the main points that I saw when I read the article. So let's slide over there. As we look at education and evangelism in the English colonies by Joseph Watrous, University of Dayton. As a graduate student, we know how to find these articles. They are on EBSCOhost, and they are very easy to get, especially nowadays. We live in an era where you can pull up articles pretty fast. I wanted to start my very first lecture for this course by examining the origins of education as they relate to religion, as well as Native Americans in the colonies. And then we're going to shift into the birth of social studies. We'll look at that in our next readings. But I definitely want to show how education kind of starts in the colonies, because sometimes we forget how it all started. It says right here, for example, education could weaken the community because it encouraged each person to think independently. And that's what the article makes one of the arguments, is that education really wasn't something that the English really wanted, because it could actually weaken the colonies. As we scroll down here, I'm just going to go through my notes and show you some things that I saw when I read this. One thing is money. At the same time, the frontier and the opportunities for wealth and prosperity could lead the Puritan children to choose to not support the church. It seems that and that's what one of the arguments of this article is, when colonists came over, they had this idea of religion, but these endless opportunities, you could go chop some trees down, you can make some money, that kind of erodes the education system as well as the religion. So greed does that. Pilgrims promised to spread the good news of the gospel to the Native Americans. So there was an underlying promise to that, especially in the charters. But one thing that says right here is the English always looked at Native Americans as a separate nation. And this is where the term First Nation comes into play, because they always considered Native Americans to be a separate nation. If you want to, you can research on your own this term King Philip's War. That does occur, and that's where a lot of Native Americans are slaughtered. But if you read the article, you'll also remember that the majority were killed through disease. I wrote down in my notes right here that after I read this paragraph, I wrote the word segregation, because I continued to see that even though Native Americans were charged to be converted and to be educated by the Pilgrims, they always saw them as different. So even the Pilgrims who came over here segregated themselves from the Native Americans. So this idea of we are better all of a sudden starts coming into play. In his tract, it says the religious reason was to spread the gospel to the indigenous people. So you see that there is a charge with the English colonies that they want people to spread the gospel. Right here, look what it says right here. England had carried on trade with Flanders and the Low Countries. Since these were Spanish dominions, Philip II had restricted such endeavors. So when the English came over here, there were some, where do we settle? Where do we want to settle? And that you notice that all of a sudden the Spanish were already here. The Spanish were in Florida. They had universities in Mexico. So the Spanish were already doing their thing. So they were limited on where they could travel and where they could settle. Because of this, they decided to start moving towards what became known as the Virginia and the Massachusetts area. The social reason was that the enterprise would offer employment to the number of idle men. Virginia contained unused resources that would make England richer. So England clearly had an unemployment problem. And by sending these colonists over to the New World, they could eliminate some of this unemployment. Also, Virginia had good resources. It was away from the Spanish-controlled South, and they were able to do their own thing. It says right here that community, once the American Indians had accepted Christianity. that the colonists would live together in peace and community once the American Indians had accepted Christianity. The New English colonists may have accepted this possibility, but this essay will argue that their theology posed problems for them. So one of the original charges of the colonists from the charter by James and by Elizabeth was to convert and to preach and gospelize the Christianity, the Christian faith to the Native Americans. Now look right here, it says, here's the first charter. While it's not clear that either Elizabeth or James read the manuscript, James first extended to a group of merchants, including the younger Hoplite, a charter to establish colonies in Virginia. So this was the first charter. The charter actually traveled in a large chest, and the chest would be given to, it was on the ship, and when they landed where they were going to settle, there was really no place they were supposed to land. It wasn't like you travel at this latitude and longitude. It was you just go over there in this vicinity and you settle your chart. You settle. And once they stopped, they unloaded their ship, they would bring out the chest and they would open it, and there would be the copy of the charter, which the ship captain had already read. But that's how they'd say, this charter says that we can now have, it's our first document. James approved the desire of the members of the company to propagate the Christian faith among the people who lived on those distant shores, the Native Americans. He added that he wanted the settlers to occupy the area, to fortify it against incursions, and to exploit the available wealth. So that's what the first charter says. The first charter for the first colony talks about making money, having fortifications, and occupying the area. And if you can, go ahead and expand the faith. There was also economic motives. Money was a big issue. The colonists who came to New England sought to avoid conflicts of religious ideas. The question concerned the extent that the bishops appointed by the English crown should influence local church practices. So you start seeing this idea of politics creeping in. But God, and God is a major part of the Puritan faith. And we see this. And down here it says, although their charter asked them to send back wealth, the colonists' primary aim was to preserve their faith, and the second was to evangelize the Native Americans. So preserve your faith. Yes, you can send some money back, but also, if you can, convert some of the First Nation. In this section right here it says, did the church, the home, and the school reinforce each other in the New England colonies? So the colonies have now been established. This right here says, this whole paragraph discusses the idea that in the Puritan faith with the colonies, this idea that the church was number one is not true. That the number one agent was the family. The family was the number one agent. That's what they said right here. Crimmen thought the family was the most important in the colonies. Church had instructed them on the best ways to live. The family was it. School was the weakest. So it really went family, church, and then school. Family, church, then school. Some students attended a petty or a dame school. There was also Latin grammar schools to teach people Latin. But for the most part, the Puritan faith, the Puritan idea of going to church was second to family. So family was the number one agent in these local Puritan areas. At the same time, Crimmen noted that the home, the church, and the school took on different emphasis in each of the colonies. For example, Virginia, the household had the most influence. Parishes covered more than 100 square miles. So the church becomes less of an influence. And schools existed in only very few areas. They were very densely populated. So these three agents of socialization, family, church, and school, in many of these colonies, it shifted differently. In the large cities, schools were there, but family was the key element to it. Down here you'll see the word Quakers, Mennonites, and Moravians formed their own isolated communities around their own meeting houses or churches. So you start seeing that in some areas different religions start emerging. In each case, though, the colonies maintained that education should advance piety, civility, and learning. The first was the institution of family. The church and the school reinforced each other. So that's the whole argument in those pages right there. Edmund S. Morgan suggested that the idea of family weakened the influence of the church. According to Morgan, the founders of New England staked the success of their efforts on the church. Therefore, they confined political rights to the church members. So in England, if you were part of the church, you had political power. But in the colonies, the political power, people were concerned about that. So that's what this whole paragraph talks about. So why would you, if you were a good member in the church, try to expand other people's political power in the church? So why would you bring someone in and then try to make them an elder in the church? Because they would have more political power. So many of the families decided not to promote the church because they did not want to give up political power to other groups in the colonies. So that really hurts the church as well. Parents passed on their children to the church as an institution, but family was way more important. That family was the key. So that's the whole point of this argument, is when they get to the colonies, everything's about the family. And because the church was a major element of political power in England, when the church came to the colonists start saying, okay, well, the church is a political power, but my family is the most important thing. So I'm going to really focus on my family moving up as elders in the church so that they have political power. So it kind of shifts a little bit. And that's very, I like that whole idea. It keeps talking about the Great Awakening. The Great Awakening. So you may want to do some research on that. The Great Awakening, a revival movement that swept the colonies in the second quarter of the 17th century, released people from civil restraints. So if you ever want to do a Google search, look at the Great Awakening of the colonies in the 17th century. Corrosive nature of piety. Another historian, Paul Lucas, reinforced Bushman's contentions about the corrosive nature of piety. Studying the churches that grew up along the Connecticut River, Lucas found the various church leaders who settled the river valley hoped that their particular church would provide the moral basis for an orderly and communal society. Since they wanted each church to be independent, they broke into factions that supported one theological arrangement or another. And because of that, they had kind of a weak church hierarchy, which in this article talks about really hurts some of the church organization of the colonies. So if you had a poor leader, then you end up with poor spiritual political power. Laws were passed to become where everyone had to start learning. We start seeing this. This right here talks about making the mark. I thought that was kind of cool. Let's see if I can get on the right page. It's page 211 says, all right, so I want to go back. I apologize. So right here, poor church leaders hurt the movement of building the church. In 1660, it says right here, New England contained about 60,000 settlers. So we start seeing, this whole paragraph talks about a huge boom in population that really just made everything bigger. You're talking about, look at these numbers here, 25,000 immigrants, 60,000 immigrants, 450,000. We have King Philip's War that occur. So this becomes a very huge idea. And this is where the thesis of this right here, this argument says, money and growth killed the religions in the colonies. They had this idea of having a church and building a church. Now, I'm not saying that Christianity died. Don't think that. We're talking about the idea of the Puritan faith that was in England. This idea of a church, a political power, that people would move up, they'd become elders, and they would have and then each church would be connected with other churches. Then you'd have bishops and ideas like that. So keep that in mind. But when you get to the colonies, you really lose that because you've got 25,000 people in an area, and then all of a sudden you start putting up your churches. Well, those churches are connected. Well, then all of a sudden you got 40,000. The next year, more people come in. So then you got people wanting to make money, people who are trying to get rich. You've got this huge growth going on. So everything becomes fragmented. And that's what killed the institution of the religion that they were trying to mirror from the Puritans, from England. This idea that this new world, everyone could do whatever they wanted to do. So the Quakers start creating their own little organizations, and the Mennonites go over here and do their thing. So it's just, It's an amazing time to be in the colonies, but the mirror reflection of the Puritans and the Church of England that was in England does not take place. So people always say, this country was founded on religion. Yes, it was founded with the basis of a religious or a Christian belief. However, that's where it really ends. It does not mirror what was over there. When it comes over here, it becomes just a wonderful endeavor where people do their own thing. There's freedom of religion. People are just jumping around, doing all this stuff. It's really an amazing time to be in here. But this idea that we just copied England's religion is not true. And that's what this thesis makes this a very good argument about. Laws were passed on page 211. I'm back on my notes. Laws were passed that people had to learn. This right here talks about that Puritans and Pilgrim colonists in Plymouth liked their books. One guy wrote in his will all of the books that he owned, but then he made his mark instead of signing his name. So he was probably illiterate, but he still liked to own books. That's what they. So I'm going to put a keyword here of happy. Happy. So if you listen on the test and it says, what's the keyword? The keyword is happy. While the general court may have cited community, instead of a school, the town leaders appointed 4 men to visit the families in the town. So there becomes less, and that's what they talk about here on this section right here. I'll highlight it for you. Instead of a school, the town leaders appointed 4 men to visit the families in the town to verify the children and the servants were following the ways of God. It was not until 1692 that the residents of Sudbury appointed a master to teach writing and bookkeeping. So there was no uniform way to create schools. In our undergrad classes, we talk about Latin schools and grammar schools. But you see that because family was the key element, followed by church loosely, and then the institution of schools, schools really take a long time to get developed. A long time to get developed. It talks about the horn book. Because this is a graduate class, we can actually, many times we just say it was a horn book. But you see that the one instrument was a page of written script fastened to a board and covered by a translucent film of horn, therefore incorrectly called a horn book. This idea that it was a horn and then that's just not, it was just incorrectly called that. So they start bringing out basically writing for people to learn, and that's the whole element of the horn book. As you scroll through here, you can see that they have the primer, express the sinful state of humankind with the maxim, and that's where we start getting into the old Puritan belief that you have the pure interpretation of the Bible, and it's really a lot of these early colony writings that you see, these early publications that come off the horn book, really depict the fall of man, the fall of Lucifer. And that's what we see a lot. The reason I say the fall of Lucifer is you have to study the old theology books to see how that was. That Lucifer was one of the top angels. Lucifer gets thrown. He goes against the throne, and he gets thrown down with half of the angels into the pit of darkness. And with the pit of darkness, he ends up pulling himself up with his broken wings. And he says, okay, y'all will follow me now. And his entire goal in life is to get enough people to follow him so he can go against the throne again. So that's what the Puritans always believed, that when you were bad, it was the devil had you. So a lot of these Puritans had this idea that it's the fall that you need to avoid, that Adam's fall, Adam went against God and he lied to God and he ate the apple, that Adam's fall was what we have to avoid, that sin was evil, and that when you sin, it is the devil trying to get you, and you have to, that's why a lot of times in those Puritans churches, they would beat children, because you have to spare the rod, spoil the child, that whenever you are doing something bad, it's because the devil got you, and you have to ultimately fight the devil the same way God did, and to do that, they would beat him. So they would do that a lot. And so you see that. So when you look at the original horn books, you see a lot of this idea of Adam's fall, that the Bible's there to help you, that you're supposed to mend your sins. You see a lot of that, a lot of tough reading. The point is the configuration of the family, the church, and the school did not lead to a rigid or firm sense of community among the Puritans. In the new land where money and opportunity flowed rampantly, these elements could work against each other constantly. At the same time, the individualism that permeated the Puritan faith contradicted with the Puritans' desire to spread goodness through the society. And therefore, it caused problems with Native Americans. So the Puritans were about spreading the word, but because you have people talking about making money, and you have the family comes first, well, that goes against the Puritan belief. So, wow, you've got all these different worlds going on, and you have all these ideas. So that's the first several pages of this article. And so I'll just take a pause here and I'll upload this section, and then we're going to continue back with how did the Puritans believe in personal independence influence their relations with Native Americans.